in classics from Bard College. He became a Latin teacher. He also became an artist, and more specifically a tattoo artist, and also runs a very successful tattoo place called Tsunami Tattoo with his wife in Portland, Maine. And actually, funny fact is, my daughter wanted to get a tattoo in high school, and my husband said, if you wait till you graduate from college, I will pay for it, and I will even go with you and get a tattoo myself. And guess where they got their tattoos together? At Tsunami Tattoo, which is about 5-6 years ago. So that you've run that place for a long time. So, but Phuc Tran is also an author, and that's why we're here. He recently published Sigh, Gone. It's a misfits memoir of great books, punk rock, and the fight to fit in. The book was very well received. It was widely reviewed. Unfortunately, it was published at the same time as a global pandemic hit Earth, so to say. So his book tour got canceled, and he had to do all these interviews through Zoom or through podcasts, through radio shows. So I'm sure you're well versed, more than I am. I'm sure I'll be rambling on here and there, so just stop me when I do that. The book got a couple awards already. I know he got the prize for nonfiction from the New England Book Awards, and this Thursday, Phuc we'll find out if he also won a Maine Literary Award. And that's one of the reasons we had to move the interview night. I want to just mention quickly, if you have any questions for Phuc, you can put them in the chat bar, and I will keep checking them and ask them if and when appropriate. Phuc will also do some reading for us. And I want to start by asking Phuc what his connection is to Maine, how he came to be in Maine, and how he became an author. So take it away.
Yeah, sure. Anna, do you want me to answer those questions first before I jump into the reading?
Sure.
Yeah, sure. So I came to Maine in 2003. My wife and I were living in New York City, and we were just sort of doing the math of, what adulthood looked like, raising a family and buying a home and starting a business, and all those things seemed cost prohibitive in New York City. So my wife is from Maine, so she showed me this brochure of Maine, and it said the way life should be. And I was like, well, that's pretty much perfect, right? And so we moved to Portland in 2003. And so Maine has, for me, fully delivered on its motto of the way life should be. And also, I guess, under Paula Page, open for business as well. So I guess I've been busy doing all the things. I really just aspire to live up to whatever motto Maine is going to put on the turnpike. So yeah. And in 2012, I gave a TEDx talk. And then the very, very short version is from that TEDx talk, I got some national attention. And then a New York literary agent approached me in 2016 and asked me if I was interested in writing memoir, because it seemed like I had an interesting story and an interesting way to tell it. And so I embarked on this writing process in 2016. And then, as you mentioned, in 2020, the book came out because, the pandemic started in March, and I thought I could, spice things up and make things a little more interesting by publishing my memoir during the pandemic, because why not? So here I am. So I thought, so Anna and I talked about my doing just two brief readings from the book. It's funny, I sort of always feel ambivalent about doing the reading, because it kind of feels like you could all do this for yourselves and probably do a better job than I could. but then Anna reminded me, well, maybe people are showing up here tonight and they haven't read your book. And I was like, okay, so it's a good point. So maybe this will give you some context for the questions that are going to come later. And so just to avoid your staring at my forehead while I'm looking down at the book, which nobody really wants to look at, I have a slideshow. So I'll have a slideshow just like family photos and photos of my town that will accompany the reading, and hopefully it'll make some sense, or at least keep you from staring at my shiny forehead. So I'm going to do share screen, and then hopefully you'll still be able to hear my voice. Great. And I can see Anna, and she'll give me a thumbs up if things look good. Yeah.
Yep.
Super. Great. So each chapter of my book is named after a great literary work. It's sort of a lens through which I tell the stories of the chapter. So the prologue of the book is entitled The Picture of Dorian Gray. Nestled in the Susquehanna Valley town of Carlisle, Pennsylvania, Carlisle Senior High School sprawled as a monolithic mid-century modern block of types, archetypes and stereotypes. Industrial gray lockers ringed its hallways, the compartments narrow enough to repel most of your textbooks, but wide enough to collect the trash and detritus from your backpack. It was your own personal landfill. Linoleum floors, classrooms with chables, the combo chair tables of the 70s, blackboards, American flags, loudspeakers from which the wah, wah, wah of adult speak would drone. Our school district was so large that the juniors and seniors had their own separate high school, the so-called senior high school, and the freshmen and sophomores had their own underclassmen high school building. Carlisle High School stocked its seats and bleachers with a familiar cast from the 80s, the athletes who towered above the rest of us, the cheerleaders who lay supine beneath them, the geeks with their physics books under their arms, the preps with their tree-torns, swatches, and impeccable Benetton sweaters, a handful of black kids with MC Hammer pants and tall square afros tightly faded, punks and skaters with their leather jackets and black Converse, a few swirly hippies, the rednecks with their oily palms and cigarettes and trucks. Carlisle High School was another cultural cul-de-sac built with the craftsman blueprint of John Hughes, the Frank Lloyd Wright of teen malaise. Overwhelmingly white, Carlisle's population offered all the rainbows of Caucasia. The town's main employers were Dickinson College, the Army War College, a smoky stack of factories, and the service industries that had sprung up to support the aforementioned trifecta. In the spirit of public education, we progeny were all in the mix together. The itinerant army brats, the ivory sons and daughters of professors, doctors, and lawyers, the greasy offspring of waiters, cooks, and factory workers, and the token refugee family. The Tran family blended right into the mix like proverbial flies in the ointment. That is to say, we didn't. Carlisle's glitter was unmistakably 80s, but its structure was straight from the post-war era, bricked together by the mortar of the 50s. We had a downtown Woolworths with a chrome lunchnet counter and red vinyl stools, and a grand movie theater with its incandescent marquee. The four corners of Carlisle's town square were righted by 2 courthouses and 2 churches, Episcopalian and Presbyterian, God and law and God. It wasn't a subtle message to any of us living in Carlisle what was at the heart of the town. And the pièce de résistance, our high school, was the town's designated Cold War fallout shelter. The blue and yellow radiation placards festooned our hallways, reminding us that we were only a button push away from nuclear annihilation. From what I gleaned on television, Carlisle seemed like a slice of American pie a la mode. We bottled lightning bugs on summer nights. Trucks flew Confederate flags. We loitered at 7-Elevens and truck stops. We shopped at flea markets and shot pellet guns. My high school provided a daycare for girls who had gotten pregnant but were still attending classes. We stirred up marching band pride and fomented football rivalries. The auto shop kids rattled by in muscle cars and smoked in ashen cobbles before the first period bell. We were rural royalty, Dairy Queens and Burger Kings.
I love that.
Thanks. And I'll just read one more short piece. And this is about my family's escape from Saigon. April 1975, Saigon. I remember none of this, but I know it all. I know it all because it is the family story. I was not yet 2 when my maternal grandparents, on Hawaii, made the decision that we were all leaving Vietnam. My grandparents both worked for the US Embassy, and our family had been monitoring the thundering advance of the Viet Cong army as closely as they were fretting the quiet unraveling of the Republic of Vietnam. The call to evacuate came at the end of April, and my mother's parents made the arrangements for 10 people, themselves, my mother and father, her sisters and brothers. I was their only grandchild, as my mother was the eldest. My father chose to accompany my mother and me, leaving behind his parents and his youngest siblings who, without the proper paperwork, were unable to board the American transports. We waited for the bus that would take us to the airfield amid a swelling throng of frantic South Vietnamese. Bus after bus filled as desperate families pushed on, bulging them beyond capacity. We moved up the line, finally at the front, and were ready to board. Our bus pulled up. The doors opened. Half of my family members were already on board when, according to everyone's account, I began to shriek so loudly and inconsolably that our family agreed to deboard the bus. My grandmother comforted us as we stood in line again. Let's wait, it's okay. We'll take the next one. As we watched that bus pull away, it was struck by mortar fire and exploded, killing everyone on board. We lay on the ground, cowering. Some bystanders scrambled to the wreckage to help, but it was war, and a losing war at that. With the burning carcass of our bus still in view, we boarded the next bus, not knowing if it too would explode and kill us all. But it did not. As we passed a checkpoint, the South Vietnamese military police separated the evacuees into 2 groups, able-bodied men into one area and women and children into the other. They were conscripting men of fighting age for fodder in their last stand against the North Vietnamese army in Saigon, and all the young men from our cohort were detained. Heartbreak and terror. My father, along with my uncles, was held behind. He watched as my mother and I boarded a helicopter. One of my shoes came off with the push and pull of evacuation. We lifted off, leaving behind my shoe and my father. To where? How could we possibly find one another? The only plan was to escape from Saigon, and in the din and chaos of the evacuation, our family was broken apart. My mother and I landed on an aircraft carrier, took another helicopter, and landed at another base. That was the beginning and the end. South Vietnam collapsed. The army was in retreat. Government officials were fleeing. Even in that ending for us, in the great collapse of Saigon, it was not the end that so many others suffered. It was not crashed planes, abandoned babies, or mass executions. In that end was our beginning. In that death lay the seeds of a new life. We weren't bodies in a shallow grave. We weren't the nude children in the war photos with our clothes burned off. We were fortunate, even in the midst of such misfortune. We landed in Guam, and from there we were relocated to Wake Island. My mother was distraught. Had my father been killed? Did he manage to escape with my grandmother's connections to the embassy? How would he know where to find us? Thousands of evacuees, wrenched from loved ones, scratched out desperate notes and posted them on walls all across the airfields of Guam and Wake Island. If you see this note, find us at, we're alive and at the camp at, luck of all luck. My father and uncles were reunited with us weeks later on Wake Island. He had escaped Saigon, and somehow 4,000 miles away, and 2 weeks later, he arrived on the same island. In a refugee camp full of strangers uprooted by war, the splinters of our family were reassembled. We needed to stay together, all 12 of us, and we said this as we filled out our paperwork, talking to the camp staff, hoping to be sponsored. Only Ombawai knew English from their work at the embassy, but the army officers spoke too fast about things they didn't know, using vocabulary they hadn't learned. Refugee, relocation, asylum. The Trans were being sent to Fort Indiantown Gap in Pennsylvania. Where was Pennsylvania? We didn't know. Beggars were not choosers. Off to another camp. Upon our arrival, Red Cross volunteers and camp officials greeted us with clipboards and signs in English, which we couldn't read. Lutheran volunteers came from their parishes to help the military. My mother's side of the family was Catholic. My father, Buddhist, had converted to Catholicism to marry my mother just before their wedding. The Lutherans found us sponsors, the Burkholders and the Hooks, while my family was still wondering what Lutherans were. Who were these sponsors? Were they Lutherans? Where did they live? Carlisle, Pennsylvania. So many names, all hard to pronounce. Our sponsors found us apartments and jobs for the adults, and by the fall, my mother peeled apples at an orchard and my dad drove a cement mixer. It wasn't being a lawyer, as he had been in Vietnam, but it was a job. We needed to blend in, adopt our new country as it had adopted us. My parents were navigating all the straits and inlets of living in America. Holidays like Halloween and Thanksgiving, driving in the snow, the difference between ketchup and catsup. Within the first year of arriving in the United States, my mother got pregnant. What was more hopeful or more stupid than having a baby as a refugee family? My brother, Louis, was conceived while we were at Fort Indiantown Gap, and he was born in March 1976. Louis, or Louis, was supposed to be named Lou in accordance with a Vietnamese proverb, but my parents decided to anglicize it to Louis, an American name with a French wink wink with a French wink wink to Vietnam's Franco-colonial past. Louis' non-Vietnamese name was a small sliver of the diaspora. The assimilation had unknowingly begun while we were at the relocation camp. Maybe my brother's birth was the most hopeful thing they could have done. Maybe it divined happy days ahead in America. How would we survive? How would we fit in? Who could say whether the hardest part was behind us or ahead of us? We were tired and poor. We took one last huddle, knelt for a miracle play as we touched down in Pennsylvania that summer of 1975.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for inviting me. Okay, I'm ready for all your hard-hitting questions, Anna.
Well, you mentioned is the hardest road still ahead, and I would argue that it was a very hard road for especially your parents, but also for you, who you are kind of an in-betweener. You're in between two cultures, two languages, and all you want to do is belong. I remember when I was 6 or 7, I realized that I was the only child in my classroom that had divorced parents, which wasn't very common at the time. And I remember all I wanted it to have that not be so. And I think you had a similar feeling where you just want to be the same as everybody else. You don't want to stand apart. And so I can understand that feeling. I think whenever you read somebody's memoir, you kind of relive your own childhood along, although it was vastly different. I had a lot of moments where I thought, oh, I felt that. I felt exactly the same way. What I like about your book is the way you play with language. The way, for example, you use the word when your parents speak Vietnamese to you, you call it Vietnamesing, which I can you explain that?
Sure. Yeah, really. It was a little bit of my trying to find a less clunky way of saying said in Vietnamese. Like I felt like that just took up a lot of airtime and it felt clunky. And my minor in college was German, and I know that sometimes in slang in Germany, and I don't know if this is true in Dutch as well, but like they'll say kannst du Deutschen instead of like kannst du Deutsch sprechen, and so so it was like, can you German? And I was like, oh, I like that. Like, that's so efficient, right? It's shocking, right? That German would do something efficient. And so I really just stole that from German. And it seemed to make sense, but thanks for noticing that. Yeah,
I like that a lot. And you also, when you talk about cutting up your socks to get wristbands, and then you phonetically, your mother says wristband, or I don't know how
wristbands, yeah.
I love that about your play with language. I want to talk a little bit about the chapters and the books you used. Are those books that are your favorite, or did they come natural to you to pick those 11 or 12 books?
Yeah, for sure. Like, I think, so each chapter of the book is told through a, sort of a book that, I would say, They're not all books that I've returned to reread, but there were books for me that when I read them really cracked open like a pretty significant concept or an epiphany. I would say I've reread almost all of them multiple times, with the exception of, I think, like, Carl Jung's Man and His Symbols. I mean, that's just a dense book. But I think like the first time I read it and learned about this idea of like archetypes and like Jungian, sort of psychology, like that was really like pretty mind blowing for me. But everything else in there, like The Scarlet Letter and Crime and Punishment and Madame Bovary, I've read those all at least 5 or 6 times. I mean, I would say, maybe it's a little hyperbolic, but I would say that those are all desert island books for me.
Now, would you recommend these books to your own children, or you think different list of great books?
No, I no, absolutely. I wouldn't. I frankly, I wouldn't recommend these books to anybody except myself. I mean, I'll say this. I think if people are curious about books that have, moved me really profoundly, like I'm always curious about connecting with other readers over shared loves of books. I think that's like sort of one of, if not the most powerful thing about literature. I think after maybe the conversation between you and the author, right? Like I think when you read a great book, you're really entering into a conversation or a brief relationship with the writer. But I think when you triangulate that relationship and then you meet somebody else who also loves the same book that you love, I can't, every time, like that really makes me giddy. And like, I just love that so much. And because really like at the heart of it, it's about community, right? And finding and being seen, right? And being, and that was for me, like one of the most powerful places where I felt like my experience was seen was in sort of like these great books, like, The Scarlet Letter or something like that, or Charles Dickens. Anyway, but I think I'm excited for my daughters to find other books that move them and connect with their experiences, because their experiences are, gosh, hopefully not the same as mine. And so my only hope is that, they're going to connect with great books as well, and not, a show on Netflix. Not that there's anything wrong with shows on Netflix, but I just, I would love for them to be readers first and foremost.
Yeah, I'm always saying that I'm so glad I raised my children before the internet really. I mean, we had internet, but they didn't have iPhones. In elementary school or middle school or even high school, they started getting little flip phones. So it's going to be much harder for you guys, I think, to keep their attention.
Yeah. And also, I don't want to be the parent that, sort of buries their, his or her head into the sand and pretends that, technology and the internet doesn't exist either, right? It's a tool like anything else. And, I mean, we can use it for good or we can use it for evil.
I see a couple of questions popping up in the chat box. One of them is about your father, and I did want to talk about that. You grew up with a lot of violence. I would say, torture, even when you had to sit on grains of rice, your knees, and when they pretended to abandon you on the side of the road. And you kind of talk about that your father had his own history of abuse, and that's partially cultural, but of course you were able to break that cycle somehow. And one of the questions is, how has your relationship developed with your father as an adult? And have your parents read your memoir, and what is their take on it?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think, I think I can't ever answer this question without, sort of naming the sort of counseling and therapy that I did in my 30s, which was, I think, fundamental to, sort of both my being a parent and my being a son. I mean, because those things are really flip sides of the same coin, right? I mean, there's only that relationship is really binary, right? That you're either a parent or a child, and then, you're one, or you're always going to be someone's child, and then eventually you might be someone's parent, but and so you transition to the other side. And so, in my 30s, like right before I became a parent, I just thought I had a lot of things to unpack and heal from my childhood. And so I did a lot of therapy and counseling. And so that really mended my relationship with my parents to the degree that it can be mended. You know, I think my parents are still, you know, they still have their quirks, I guess, to be to be kind about it. They're you know, challenging people. And I can't ask them to be people they're not. And so that was like, you know, for me, that's like a huge breakthrough in counseling, right? And that I can either accept the relationship that they're able to offer me, or I don't need to. But I think so much of the tension from my childhood was needing them to be parents that they couldn't be. You know, and also the sort of other miscommunications that are happening because of, you know, so many other things. And did my parents read the book? So, you know, they didn't for a long time. And then maybe 7 or 8 months after it came out, we were on a text thread. And I just said, hey, have you read the book, by the way? You know, you don't have to, like, obviously, like, I don't want you to read it if you don't have to, or, you know, want to, but just curious, like, did you read the book? So I texted that to my dad, and, you know, and he just texted back, yes, I read it. It was very painful. And then that was really it. That was, you know, that's all I had to say about it.
Well, you know, I'm sure he's processing it in his own way. Um, Another question here is, did you go through phases of wanting to be less Vietnamese and then later more? Was it a cycle or a straight line? Were there
Yeah.
trigger events such as having children?
Sure. I definitely went through phases of wanting to be, yeah, I don't know if it was less Vietnamese, but feeling more American. And it seemed like, so I think like that was, and I think it's a subtlety that you know, that it was really like just wishing that, you know, that the table were longer, or that there were a seat at the table for me, you know, and the point at which that I really felt like you know, this Vietnamese thing is not great was, you know, like every time I was getting bullied at school, you know, it was always because I was Vietnamese. I was like, well, you know, this sucks, right? Like, you know, and especially as a young kid, like you're doing the math, right? And you're thinking, well, they're bullying me because I'm Vietnamese, because literally every time like someone pushes me or punches me or whatever, like it's always followed up with some sort of, you know, pejorative about, you know, not being from here. And so you just are like, well, I guess if I were from here, this wouldn't be happening, right? You know, of course, like this is like childhood logic, and kids got picked on for all sorts of things. You know, and I think in my later adulthood, I don't know if like it's a pendular swing where like it's gone all the way back to the other side, where like I'm like, you know, it's like everything is Vietnamese all the time. You know, in some ways, like I like the beauty of like an American identity, at least as I see it, is like, you know, there's just like a vast choice of things that you can choose to take on and leave things behind, right? And so in some ways, like I feel like I've gotten to cherry pick all the best parts for me, like all the best things that I love about American culture and all the best things that I love about Vietnamese culture, and also to kind of like leave behind the things that aren't great about Vietnamese culture, like the corporal punishment and sort of like the lack of talking about your emotions, and you know, I mean, there are problematic things in sort of like traditional Vietnamese culture that I don't feel like I need to carry on. And then same is true for, I think, American culture, such as it is. So yeah, I guess I'm a hybrid, like the rest of us.
Yes, in a way we all are.
Right.
Um, I talked to you about this when we spoke the other day. Your book does not really address your artistic awakening. You are now an artist, a tattoo artist. And one of the questions is, would you share more about your relationship with art as a practice of thriving, and how you chose tattoo as part of your artistic practice?
Sure. You know, it was a big thread in, you know, my life all through high school and even earlier. And when I went off to college, I thought I was going to double major in art and English. You know, the reason it doesn't show up in the book was just really like a matter of length. You know, like the book was already sort of, too long. And so we just couldn't, I think any book or any attempt to capture your life is going to be incomplete, in the way that like a photograph or even one photo album with 100 photos is not going to capture, everything that is important to you. So I loved drawing and painting, and my senior year of high school, I actually ended up winning like this, sort of national award for my portfolio, and then went off to college and then ended up not majoring in art at all. But the tattooing piece, all of my punk rock friends in high school were always getting tattooed. I just never got tattooed in high school because it was expensive and I didn't have any money. And so in college, my parents had given me a credit card for emergencies, and I discovered that the credit card had a cash advance function, and I was like, what is this? So I put it in the ATM. I was like, free money. So I immediately like took money out on the with a cash advance function, and then went and got tattooed in college. So that was how I finally got my first tattoo. And then and so I just kept getting. What's that?
Can you show that one to us, or is it in a hidden place?
Oh, it's like I have to take off my shirt and sweatshirt.
Okay.
Yeah, it's on my chest. Yeah. So I got my first tattoo in college, and then and then I kept getting tattooed through graduate school, and then eventually at the end of graduate school, I was offered a tattoo apprenticeship, and then I applied, got the tattoo apprenticeship, and then moved to New York City. So where I just learned to tattoo at night, and then taught Latin during the day, high school Latin. Yeah, that makes total sense, right?
Is there any way for you to show us any of your tattoo art? Do a show, or is that complicated?
Tattoo, I could show you tattoo art that I've let me see here. You mean like tattoos that I've done, tattoos that I've done? Yeah, let me see. I've got some, I think if I did the screen share again, I might be able to do that. Let's see.
That was a question from one of the.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I can. Yep, I can. Yeah, you all want to show and tell here? Let's do this. So I can. Sure. So these are just like random tattoos. This is great. Look, it's a picture of a. Can you see that, Anna?
Yes.
Anna? Yeah. So it's a picture of a book with a key. Cool. Let's see what else. Let's see. Sorry, let me.
That's okay.
Yeah.
While you're looking, another question is, do your kids speak Vietnamese?
Yeah, they don't. Because my wife doesn't speak, Vietnamese. It's a little bit tricky, just because then like I feel like I've constantly got to be translating for her. I'm speaking to them. And plus my Vietnamese is really like kind of like what I like to call kitchen Vietnamese. In that my vocabulary is pretty limited. Let me. I'll just do another quick screen share here. I think this might work. Then you can. So can you see that, Anna?
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. So that's a portrait of a client's grandmother and grandfather that I did. Let's see here. This is like a nautical sea monster. Let's see, this is like this is what's called a sleeve. So that's like on a client's arm. He's actually, he's like a professor at UMass. He's a sociology professor.
Oh,
so
yeah?
You never know what's lurking underneath people's shirts, right? This is the Virgin Mary, right? Gosh, there's another dragon. Let me find, there's like a little black and gray stone Buddha. There's a tattoo of Darth Vader for those of you who really love Star Wars. So yeah, how's that? This is a client. This is his whole front chest area there.
Wow.
Yeah. How's that? Is that good enough? Okay. Here's the last one. This is a great one. I love this one. I did this one of a great white shark on a client's art. Yeah. So it really runs the gamut. So yeah.
Actually, talking about your kitchen Vietnamese, one of the questions is if you have you actually traveled back to Vietnam to do research or to reconnect emotionally to allow for even more depth in your book? And part of my question would be is how are you received there as somebody who doesn't speak fluent Vietnamese?
Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't traveled back to Vietnam. I was, for a long time I was trying to convince my parents to go with me, because I think it would just be a richer experience if my parents were able to travel with me and my family, or with me and my wife. And my parents actually, I think like that's the nature of stateless people or refugees as opposed to immigrants. I think, like refugees are leaving a country because they don't have a choice to stay. And so my parents refused to go back to Vietnam. In their eyes, like it doesn't exist. And so, I spent a long time trying to convince them that, it would be okay for them to go back. But, in their eyes, if they went back, they would just be giving money to the communist government that, destroyed their country and, killed their family and friends. And so I finally stopped trying to convince them to go with me. And then my kids were born, and so now we're just kind of waiting for them to be old enough before we go back. So I can't say how I'm received there, but yeah, I haven't been there yet. It's high on my list of places to go, especially now that the kids are older. And I guess as long as we're all vaccinated and gotten all our shots, it should be okay.
Now, your children are biracial. Have you ever um, rethought the choice of having them grow up in such a white state as Maine?
Huh. No, I don't. That's so interesting. I think, um, I mean, Portland, the city of Portland is pretty diverse. And I think we've got a pretty rich group of friends. And I think they have I think like my wife is so proud to be a Mainer, and she's so proud of their Maine heritage, and so I think if anything, I'm just excited that I'm raising these two biracial women in Portland, and they're so deeply proud of their Maine roots. And they, I think if anything, I'm hoping that we're broadening the idea of what it means to be a Mainer. So yeah.
Right. Another question here. How do your personal insights on the need to belong affect your teaching?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. And I think it's, I mean, I think it affects so much, not just my teaching, but I think, that idea of belonging is so powerful, and the subtitle of the book was The Fight to Fit In. And we put it in there specifically because it ultimately ends up being a red herring, for me as a teenager. And I think it's a red herring for many teenagers. It's a sort of, it's like, fool's errand, because the idea of fitting in means, what do I need to keep changing about myself in order for other people to accept me, right? And that's so problematic in so many ways. And it's certainly not something that only kids who are refugees or kids of color or whatever, have experienced. I think many teenagers, if not all, right, experience this feeling of like, if I just could change this about myself. You know, the very smart Brene Brown says that the opposite of fitting in is belonging, which is your question, right? And so I think when I think about teaching and think about teenagers nowadays, the idea of belonging really is, for me, underpinned by three ideas, or three sort of like really important mechanisms, right? Like, so belonging, I think, for me, means being seen, being valued, and being understood. So I think so when I teach, I try to make sure that every kid in my classroom feels seen, valued, and understood. Because I think the sense of belonging is at the heart of any community. And I think I think we could all extend those things to each other, especially as we live in community, and certainly to my kids and, people in our family. And it's easy to miss one or two of those things, right? And that's sort of where dysfunction and sort of like lack of community comes from, I think.
Right. I have actually a question about the title. I love it. Again, it's a wordplay on Saigon, where you're from. But Can you explain the title to me or to our audience?
Sure, yeah. So yeah, obviously it's a pun on the city of Saigon, which doesn't exist anymore, right? Like it's now called Ho Chi Minh City. So like the Saigon is hopefully like it's evocative of something that's been lost. Right. So, hopefully it feels a little wistful. So there's that piece of it too, right? So like what do we lose or what do we gain in the process of, you know, going from one country to another, or the process of assimilation, the process of growing up, like all those things, right? Like there's like it's not just a net gain, right? Like there's always a trade-off in some way. And the other piece of it really is this kind of funny experiment of wanting to put the reader into my shoes for just a moment. It's a metaphor for just sort of like the American experience for me, in that it looks one way but sounds another way, right? So if you say the word Saigon, right, it sounds like the city of Saigon, but it looks like the words sigh and then gone. And almost every, many of the radio interviews that I've done, people are forced to spell it out like Sighgone, which is literally what I have to do every time I call in food for takeout, or I'm ordering plane tickets. Like it's never as easy as like, oh, I'm John Smith. Like, I always have to stop, say my name, spell it out for whoever is on the other line. And it's not like it's not like an aggrievement for me, like it, but it's just like a funny little thing that I just want people to pause and have to do when they talk about my book, is to pause and spell it out, which is, pretty much my experience all the time. Yeah.
Let's see if there's another question here from Moira. Languages are obviously one of your delights. I think you speak 5 languages, right? Or
Yeah. I mean, on a good day, like maybe, yeah, 3 or 4, 3.5, 4.5. Yeah. No one speaks Sanskrit. So yeah, I wouldn't.
oh, right. And Latin isn't spoken too much.
Yeah. Yeah. My Latin's pretty good though. Yeah.
Um, Moira is asking this, and she says, "I'm a linguist by profession, so I approve. Do you remember when your dreams turned from Vietnamese to English, or when you started counting in English, not Vietnamese? Perhaps you were too young when all that happened."
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I was monolingual, like a monoglot, until, gosh, I went to school, like around 5 or 6, like so kindergarten. And then I was probably bilingual. I mean, I think like literacy, like sort of like the instruction of literacy really, accelerated English very quickly. And then at that point, once you're not reading in your own language, like it kind of like stalls out at a certain place. So I don't know, probably like elementary school or middle school. I mean, like if I have dreams and I have family members in my dreams, like they speak Vietnamese in my dreams. And I remember my minor was in college was German, and I went to Germany and studied abroad there for a semester. And like I remember like having dreams in German. I was like, oh yeah, that a thing? Like I don't, yeah. But so I think it sort of just depends on where I am and whatever language I'm sort of like plugged into.
I had that similar experience when I first moved to New York City. After, I would say, about a month, I started dreaming in English, and I remember waking up thinking, I dreamt in English. You are really aware of that when that happens for the first time.
Yeah, it's very strange.
Um, I wanted to ask you another question. You mentioned somewhere in the book about wanting to be a Renaissance man, or am I the Renaissance man? And are you the Renaissance man? The way you envisioned yourself, you would.
Right. My father says it, I'm a master of none, right? That's very funny. I don't know. I think I just have a lot of passions and a lot of interests. And I think now that I have children, I'm really acutely aware of trying to model for them, sort of like an adventurous, sort of the wild yawp of life, like that no adventure starts with no. So I think if I have an opportunity to do something, or if I have an interest in something, like I'm all in. And I do lots of things badly too, like my creme brulee is like a disaster, but it doesn't stop me from trying, like, or Yeah, baking is not my strong suit, but like, boy, that banana bread, like I find, like, for the pandemic, like I got the banana bread down. And so like I just really, I don't know, I love trying new things. And um I'm really excited by things that I'm bad at, because it feels to me like that's like the places in which I have like the learning curve is much steeper. And I really love that piece of it. Like when you go from being a novice to just being like intermediate. Like I remember, like with German or with Latin or with tattooing, when you go from being like terrible to being like just average, like it's so steep but so satisfying. And then when you plateau, when you do like the Malcolm Gladwell's like 10,000 hours of tattooing, it's just like, it's fine. Like, and like your advances are so incremental, that it's, for me, still more satisfying to like go from like 0 to like 5 than to go from like 9.5 to 10.
Yeah, I always like to at least learn one new thing every year, or at least be very uncomfortable doing something every year.
Yeah, what is that this year for
Well,
you?
I learned to row for the first time in my life.
Hey, yeah. Well, like in a canoe
No, in a
or?
scull, in a
Oh yeah. Oh, like real rowing. Yeah, like
or
like
eight people
competitive rowing. Yeah.
in a boat. And in the past, I would do community theater, or even doing this. I'm a little out of my comfort zone, and I say yes on purpose because I like to be out of my comfort zone.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
Um, let's see. Another question here from Sue Gregson. Did your parents retain a lot of their culture and teach it to you? And I want to ask too, are they still living in Carlisle?
Yeah, no. So no, they're not in Carlisle. In fact, they live in Southern California now. So they live in Orange County, which is actually like the largest expat Vietnamese community in the U.S. When they moved out there, so right after my brother graduated high school, my parents went to California, and like they ended up meeting up with like high school friends they hadn't seen in like 25 years. It was pretty amazing. And so they kind of regressed. Like I think they like met up with all their high school friends, and then like all of a sudden like they're texting me pictures of them like being at a bar or something, and I'm like, what are you guys doing? um Sorry, so what was the first part of that question?
Did they retain a lot of their culture
Oh,
and
yeah.
pass it on to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think Vietnamese culture, especially in the US, has mutated a little bit, as it would inevitably mutate. Like, so I think like there's like a kind of Vietnamese diaspora culture that I think is not maybe as there's not like, it's not like exactly, sort of like Vietnamese culture, but I don't know if I could speak to it, only because like I haven't spent like, I didn't grow up in Orange County or even in like a diasporic community. And I want to say a little bit about that too, just really briefly, is that, the whole reason that we ended up in Carlisle to begin with was that when the United States government was resettling Vietnamese refugees, so there was about 130,000 in that first wave in 1975. And the United States government was like, "Oh, what do we do with all these people?" And they decided that it was better to just have everyone not live together. And so there was actually a federal policy called the Refugee Dispersion policy, and the idea was that they wanted to resettle all the refugees as far apart from each other as possible, with the idea that they wouldn't form ethnic enclaves, and they wouldn't have like little Saigon or little Vietnam, and that they would learn English and acculturate and assimilate faster. It's sort of like the cultural equivalent of throwing someone into the deep end. And so that's why we ended up in Carlisle and stayed there. Um, and it took a lot longer for the Vietnamese diaspora to sort of for people to find each other and like sort of coalesce and find a community. It was specifically because of that federal policy.
Carlisle was actually the home too of a Indian boarding school where
Yeah,
they,
yeah, yeah. I lived like half a mile from the Jim Thorpe School. Yeah,
yeah, and a lot of Maine Native American children were sent there
yeah. That's not.
with the idea of having them assimilate as soon as possible and not speak their own language and not be who they are really.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's not. It's not great.
The Dutch government did the same thing with all the Indonesian people that moved to the Netherlands after uh, Indonesia became its own state, and all the people that worked or fought on the side of the Dutch ended up in Holland, and they tried to disperse them everywhere, all over the country.
Yeah, I mean, that idea of assimilation is just like so odd, like I just, so part of the diaspora, right, is that, so at least in Vietnam, right, like lots of Vietnamese people went to France as well because Vietnam was a French colony for a long time. And I just learned this recently that in France, regardless, so France as a colonial power, right, has people coming from North Africa and Vietnam and other parts of Africa as well. And um, in France, if you're born in France, it was actually illegal for you to have a non-French name until like the 90s, I think. So like there was like a list of approved French names that you could name babies if they were born in France. So like I would have never been born Phuc, or it would have been like,
Right.
and all of my cousins are all named, like Aline, David, and Annalise and Mathieu and all that stuff. It's just
That was actually a law. That was amazing.
yeah, yeah.
I actually uh, just looked at the time and we're almost done. So I'm going to ask you one last question that's here in the chat box. And that is, as you get older, do you feel the desire to connect more deeply to your Vietnamese heritage or to share with your children? I think some of that you've already addressed, but maybe you can finish.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think, it's hard for me to even know what, um, I feel like it's so deeply baked into who I am. And it's really hard to sort of pull apart the DNA, like I don't even know, like, is like my work ethic or my drive, like, is that like specifically Vietnamese, or is it cultural, or is it just like sort of familial? Like we don't wear shoes in our house. Like, like I feel like that's pretty stuff, clearly like an Asian slash Vietnamese thing, like I cook Vietnamese food, like my daughter knows how to use chopsticks. Beyond that, we observe like Lunar New Year, like, and I think again, like I'm not sure. Um, I, you know, I, I think I have so many other resources for myself to feel supported by a community, especially here in Portland with our friends and stuff. And so, um, I don't, like I'm not ashamed of being Vietnamese, but at least as far as connecting to that heritage as a source of strength or direction or comfort, like that's not really like a thing that I need it for. If that makes any sense, like I think I connect with people much more over books and music and movies and things like that, and language, right? Or the love of the outdoors, and that's but that's I think for certainly for some, like my cousins who grew up in California, who are also expats, or Vietnamese Americans, like I think they just sort of naturally need like a community of like Vietnamese Americans in a way that I don't. And I would say my brother is also similar to me, and I don't know if that is because of our upbringing in Carlisle, but yeah, this is not something that I seek out, but it doesn't come from a place of anything other than I think I have so many other things that are pillars of strength for me.
Right. Well, unfortunately, we are almost at 8 o'clock and we're going to finish. Thank you so much for being with us and for writing this book. I think we were able to walk in your shoes for a little bit through your childhood and understand a little bit more what it was like to be a Vietnamese refugee.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, I truly enjoyed it. It made me laugh and cringe, and it was quite an eye opener. So thank you very much. Before we finish, I want to mention that next month at the annual meeting, we have another immigrant to Maine being our featured speaker. His name is Abdi Noor Iftin. He's a immigrant from Somalia, and his memoir is called Call Me American. This is on June 23rd. He's the featured speaker at our annual meeting. It's a hybrid event. There will be people here, but it's also on Zoom. And even though it's our annual meeting, everyone is welcome. And we hope you tune in. And I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight, and especially, of course, Phuc Tran, or Phuc Tran. Sorry.
Thank you so much for having me, and good luck with the rest of the pandemic and vaccination. And summer in Maine is like the best 3 months of the year here in Maine. So I hope everyone gets out. Good luck paddling or rowing. Sorry, rowing, Anna.
Thank you very much. All right. Good evening, everybody.
Alrighty. Thank you.
Bye.